So I'd like to start the movie right now, and I'm going to try to stay quiet and just let you watch it, but once in a while we'll add some tidbits to help. There's not a whole lot we know about it. What we know about this movie is that in Colonel Matthias's diaries, he talks about the Signal Corps coming out, and it seems to have surfaced in the 70s, early 70s, when copies were given kind of out here to the Science Center and also to the archives. The head of the DuPont construction project, whose name escapes me. Anyone know it? The old church. Walked into the archives at Wilmington, Hagley, and I gave them 3 reels of 16 millimeter. And that's where this bit footage came from. But the only footage on the Wanapums is this canoe shot. And then we go into a little bit about some of the agricultural houses.
Button up your lip, don't get yourself unstrung. Jamaica, just from a slip of the tongue. Don't talk about the weather. It's a military secret. Just keep your wits together.
That's the safest way to keep it.
These are critical times. Be careful of espionage. In such critical times, you've got to watch out for sabotage. If you must talk to someone,
Don't give any information.
it's smart to be a dumb one. Simply change the conversation. Let's just talk about love, 'cause that's what I'm thinking of. And it's no military secret that I love you. Hey, how about romancing?
If you can keep a secret.
Well, can I take you dancing?
If you take my heart and keep it. I'm not saying a word. I'm careful whatever I do.
I guess everyone's heard.
One of the
I wanna get
nice aspects get to see some artifacts and signs and things like that we really don't have any information.
It's smart to be a dumb one. Simply change the conversation. Let's talk about love.
That's what I'm thinking of.
It's no secret, no secret. It's no secret that I love you.
The way the movie progresses, it starts off with kind of the infrastructure and construction and concrete,
I'm a cranky old
and then we're going to go into kind of a social third where we have a day in the life of a woman and a man,
Tokyo Bank.
the mess halls, and then we get to the construction
When
of
I set my khaki down in old
the reactors
I'll
and
be
the celebrations
like
fund.
Jackaroo. And you can bet my cracky, every shooty yacky lacky will be looking like tacky where to do. I'm a cranky old yank in the cranky old tank, and I'm heading for a hullabaloo. I'll be riding my swing little hanky-panky man through the streets of Yokohama with a Honolulu mama, singing those Tino Blanco, Hirohito blues. I'm a cranky old yank in a cranky old tank, and I'm heading for a hullabaloo. I'll be riding my tank through a Tokyo bank, sure as I'm an army buckaroo. And when I set my khaki down in old Nagasaki, I'll be singing like a wacky jackaroo. And you can bet my cracky, every shooty yacky lacky will be looking mighty tacky where we do. I'm a cranky old yank in a cranky old tank, and I'm heading for a hullabaloo. I'll be riding my swing little hanky-panky man through the streets of Yokohama with a Honolulu mama, singing those Tito, singing those Tito, flat on his Tito, flat on his Tito, hero, Tito, sun blue.
Don't you be weary. Don't you be dreaming. For that trumpet's gonna sound. Just keep your eyes peeled and keep your lazy. 'Cause when that good news gets around, they'll be like you believe. They'll be brothers and sisters, listen to me about the great day coming and that you believe. Pay attention to me, children, and listen now. When that great day comes, you'll have to holler, oh, young man, my man too. Young man, and my man too. Young man and my man too will be coming home today. Great day in the morning when that peaceful sun will be dawning. Oh, time, what a gay time. Why, the night will seem just like daytime. Happy we'll see you and me.
One of the reasons that Colonel Matthias was attracted to this area was the fact that there was to be no national or large-scale railroad within 10 miles of the site. The closest railroad at this time was the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul Pacific, who had completed a transcontinental railroad line across this country in the early 1900s. They had then built a lightweight branch line from Beverly across the Columbia River, which terminated in the town of Priest Rapids. The federal government condemned the 24.4 miles of rail that ran from the bridge to Priest Rapids, tore up a great deal of the line, and rebuilt it to accommodate the extremely heavy traffic that would be flowing into and out of Beverly. You'll notice on some of the rail lines you see a very small white sign. Those were Ys all over the site. They're where the rail Ys to go in different directions. And each Y was given a name. And they were named for all of the secretaries in the Transportation Department at Hanford. And if you go out to Hanford today, you can still see some of those very small signs with names like Ruth and Willa and things like that on those small white signs. Both the contractors and the federal government on the site emphasized the 3 S's: safety, security, and secrecy. Meetings, posters, signs of all kinds, and brochures emphasized worker safety, project security, and absolute secrecy. There were prizes and picnics for exemplary safety records, and overall, the worker injury rate here was about 50% below the normal rate on national projects of similar magnitude. The lumber, the coal, almost every single piece of construction material was brought in by the railroads and came in on the Milwaukee line to Riverland up by the Vernita Bridge. And from Riverland, it was transferred off of the Milwaukee rail cars to site rail cars. At one point, there was over 6,000 rail cars coming into the site every day, bringing in lumber, coal, construction materials, and eventually uranium billets. One of the things that was not brought into the site was concrete and aggregate. And both of those items were manufactured on the site at 2 aggregate plants right directly on the site. The railroad ballast was primarily basalt that they simply mined in the area. There was a small segment of the work crew at Hanford that was Afro-American. The barracks, the mess halls, and the recreational facilities were fairly strictly segregated, as were the transfer points when people came in to Pasco by train. It appears, though, that the work site, as well as some of the recreational facilities, such as the baseball teams, were not segregated. Many of the Afro-American men who came here to work worked at the concrete finishing, oral interviews with some of these men indicate that they were making as much as $1 an hour. Now today that sounds quite shocking, but many of these men came from other plants and other industrial occupations, especially in the South, where they were making as much as 24 cents an hour. So the attraction of 3 to 4 times that work per hour brought many, many Afro-American men to this area. The concrete and aggregate were moved across the site, across 670 square miles of territory, by two methods, by your traditional cement truck as well as by large pipes. It was mixed in a central location, a central mixing location, and then moved quickly through piping and immediately poured on the various foundations. There were also a number of tools, building equipment, laboratory equipment that was actually fabricated right on the site due to the demands of either quantity or the demands of specifications and the very, very exacting specifications of some of the things that were needed. The site quickly developed a workforce that could manufacture materials, equipment, tools, containers to very specific sites, to very specific specifications, and sometimes some very delicate materials. One of the biggest problems that Matthias had here was, of course, recruiting workers. Not only were common laborers needed, but carpenters, millwrights, tinsmiths, and a number of other electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, and also a number of very, very skilled and highly technical craftspeople. But unfortunately, even in the Northwest alone, they were competing with the demands of the shipyards in Seattle and Vancouver, and as well as the draft. And so it was a constant frustration of Matthias's to get his recruiting offices to meet the numbers, the quotas of people that he needed, to get them out here, for some of them to pass the very stringent security clearances. You will see the signs, of course, throughout this movie, reflecting the issue of working very safely, very carefully, maintaining security at all times, and certainly maintaining secrecy. As you can well imagine, traffic could be a nightmare. You have buses, thousands hundreds of buses moving workers out to various parts of the site. You also have personal vehicles as well as pickups and extremely large trucks moving construction material from place to place on the site. Security was always an issue. Security came in the form of perimeter fencing in a variety of sizes and configurations. Some of the sites were double fenced. There was a fence around the perimeter of the site as well as around individual sites such as the 300 area. And of course, the women's barracks were double fenced. In addition, there were patrols, foot patrols, truck patrols, as well as occasional flyovers with small planes. The jail was small. Most of the problems related to crime came from drunken disorderly on Friday and Saturday night. Many of the patrols simply threw the drunkard or whomever in jail to sober up overnight, and then he was sent back out to the work site on Monday morning. They really didn't have the luxury of prosecuting and jailing the people for a long period of time. Prospective employees were warned, do not bring a camera, do not bring a firearm when you come out here to come to work. If you do, they were confiscated. There was never any discussion of large knives. You can see the fence there on the left-hand side. Fire was also a very real concern for a number of reasons. Keep in mind, all of this construction equipment, this is a test fire, or a test burn for practice. You have all of this construction going on, all of the welding, all of the traffic. You have an extremely dry environment with sagebrush, tumbleweed, and grass. And you have a very real concern that if a fire were to take off, it would certainly burn up the construction in process when you're working under a very, very tight timeline, as well as Matthias talks in his journal on several occasions of the concern over contamination. In other words, if a certain facility or process, as they called it, were to burn, the smoke and the air would be contaminated, and that would then blow all over the site. All of the construction equipment had to be brought in by rail from other parts of the country. not only is Matthias trying to recruit craftspeople, construction people, and laborers, he therefore is then trying to also recruit the support personnel that's needed to maintain all of the equipment on the site. And of course, many of these people were in equally high demand in the shipyards in the Northwest, and of course, if they qualified for the draft. Matthias worked very, very hard to get many of the people he needed draft deferments. He talks frequently in his journal about an individual person that he's gone to the draft board to get a deferment because they desperately need the one person's skill out on the site here. The locomotives were coal-fired locomotives, so naturally they are a fire hazard in and of themselves. They're also having to make sure they bring in the coal needed not only for their own operation, but also for that of creating the steam that's needed for power on the site. Matthias purchased a lot of equipment from the Milwaukee Railroad. Some of it was then rebuilt in the shops here to enable it to carry the kinds of loads, either weight-wise or specification-wise, especially when they began to bring in the uranium billets and to move the billets across the site. This is the Riverland Transfer Yard. This is where the Milwaukee Road brought everything into the Hanford site and where it was then turned over to the Hanford Site Railroad. The map in the background shows the railroad as well as all of the spur lines.